Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Bentley Priory Museum's online talk today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today. He's the museum's Chair of Trustees, Marshal Cliff Spink. So Cliff has had a varied and very illustrious career in the RAF, and today he's going to be sharing with us his experiences during the Cold War as a pilot and commander. So Cliff is going to talk to us today for about 45 minutes, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions. At the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A button. Please feel free to send a question through to us at any time during the talk today, and we'll get those questions all together at the end and go through as many as we can in the time available. So I hope that you enjoy the talk today. Thank you very much, Cliff. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Christina. We've now got to get over the technology hurdle of me sharing my presentation, so bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. I'll make sure that we actually do this properly, and I'll keep Christina there for a while I do that. Okay, well, welcome to everybody who is watching. I trust that you can see, and I'm going to look at Christina now to make sure she nods that you can see Cold War on the screen. Perfect. Needless to say that the Cold War was an incredibly complex period in our history. So I'm only going to scratch a very small surface of the Cold War, where basically I was involved in my own small way. So I'm going to apologize right from the start for those people who were in other areas equally important in the Cold War. So particularly in aircraft terms or aviation terms, the bombers, the fighter bombers, the 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force in Germany, my old friends in maritime, which I commanded later on, which was an incredibly complex and important part of the Cold War. But they are almost subjects in themselves. So what I intend to talk about today, in the main, is what I call air defense operations. I might digress slightly from that, but those were the operations for which I was involved in my period in the Air Force. But I might as well start at the beginning. Cold War, just to remind us all, it was Winston Churchill after the Second World War who said there's an iron curtain coming down over Europe, and he was absolutely right. Even though Europe to a degree was carved up, and Germany was carved up, and quite reprehensibly so was Poland at the time of the end of the Second World War. Stalin very quickly started to make inroads into cementing the position in Eastern Europe. And I apologize for some of these slides, but as many of you will remember, much was centered on Germany itself. Here you see the red zone, which is the Soviet occupied East Germany, the British zone in green, French zone in blue, and the American zone in yellow. And in 1948, the Soviets then instituted a blockade, both for rail and road traffic. And the only way into Berlin was, of course, by air through the 3 corridors. And of course, all nations, put a huge amount of effort carrying everything that needed to be taken into Berlin. And this is obviously West Berlin I'm pointing out now. And we managed to fly everything from coal to supplies, everything that was needed for Berlin. And basically, we managed to do that. Interestingly, some 30 plus years later, I was the staff officer in Rheindalen, and my responsibility was the inner German border, as we called it, and the corridors, together with Gatow and Wildenrath, which was an air defense station in West Germany at that time. And nothing had changed very much in all those 30 years. So it gives you some idea of the span of years of the Cold War. Indeed, when I was a staff officer, and this is in the early 80s in Rheindahlem, the Soviets tried to put a helicopter zone at Potsdam so high that it would have precluded approach through the central corridor here. And I remember well writing a brief for the then Foreign Secretary, who met, I think it was with Gromyko in Vienna, and basically thumped the table, and the Soviets actually did withdraw. But that gives you an idea of the span. But that was 1948. Things were beginning to, shall we get, colder in the Cold War. In 1949, the Soviets, with their partners in Eastern Europe, started Comecon. And that again was beginning to bring together all of what became known as that Soviet Pact. It wasn't at that time the Warsaw Pact. I should emphasize that this was Comecon. But because of the problems associated with Berlin and many of the other pressures that were coming on, we of course formed NATO, which were basically the Western nations, heavily dependent on the Americans, of course, but nonetheless, all the Europeans signed up to it, which was really very important at that time. Now I'm going to show this aeroplane because that was all in 1949. I call the Korean War, and I mentioned the Korean War, and some of you might say, well, question, well, was that really part of the Cold War? Well, I would suggest it was. It was what we would probably call today a proxy war. And bearing in mind that it was communist forces against what we would call Western forces, and it was a pushback of the North Koreans. And I just show this airplane. I know this is a training T-33. It's actually me flying it on a lovely day. But the T-33 was actually a training version of a P-80 American fighter. Lovely airplane to fly. This particular model is powered by a Rolls-Royce Nene, but the original P-80s and T-33s had an American engine in that, slightly less power. Good airplane that this was, that it was into the Korean War. It met up with what was almost a benchmark swept wing fighter at the time, the MiG-15, which vastly outclassed the P-80 and the other straight wing fighters that were in existence at the time. Now, the Americans, this airplane was a really good performance, and it provided a benchmark of fighters and fighter trainers for the Soviets for decades to come. The Americans, for their part in Korea, had the Sabre, and again, airplane which I was delighted to fly, and this again is a lovely day flying out of Duxford. The Sabre actually was put into service with the Koreans. Sorry, I beg your pardon, with the Americans, not the Koreans, but with the Americans, really quite quickly to counter the MiG-15 threat. Now, there's much talked about the MiG-15 versus the F-86, and most people give the F-86 the ascendancy, but it wasn't quite as easy as that. This is an A model, which was rushed into service very quickly. It's essentially, you flew it. It was a manual aeroplane, was only boosted by hydraulics. So at how much control force you put into the aeroplane, it was then boosted to the amount. So if I put 1 pound of force in the control column, that was boosted by the hydraulics, but essentially a manual aeroplane. And it did have its vices, quickly superseded by the E model Sabre, which was a much better airplane, but nonetheless. And another thing about the different, the airplane that the MiG-15 was, had effectively a Rolls-Royce Nene uprated. I don't think the Americans ever forgave us for selling the Russians a Nene which they reverse engineered, uprated, and that then powered the MiG-15. It was more powerful than the Sabre. It would outclimb and it would fly higher than the Sabre. So the Sabre pilots, I don't think we were very popular with the Americans for selling it, because this airplane, good that it was, it had a brilliant wing and it was probably better to handle. I didn't fly the MiG-15, but it only had 6.5 machine guns, which would have been good in the Second World War, but typical of the Soviets, they put a mighty cannon and other guns in the MiG-15. And as the American pilots said, if you got hit by a MiG-15, you stayed hit. Anyway, nonetheless, we did win that conflict, and the F-86 spawned other fighters. One very good thing about the MiG-15, which I'll come back to later on, look at that lovely canopy. The visibility out of the F-86 was superb. Anyway, the consequence of that was we did fly Meteors in Korea. They were largely outclassed again by the MiG-15, but the Meteor was actually in UK, was one of our mainstays of our own United Kingdom home defence, together with airplanes like the Vampire and the Venom, and then being introduced the Hunter. I'll talk more about this. So our airplanes, frankly, were playing a bit of catch up. One good thing about our airplanes, we had decided to go away from our pop guns, and we armed, in this case, this is an F8 Meteor, had 4 20mm cannons. So it did have a reasonable punch, but vastly outclassed by the MiG-15. The Hunter was obviously going to be better than the MiG-15, but it was taking time to come in. And as a consequence, we bought several squadrons of Sabres to bridge the gap before we got to the Hunter. Meanwhile, we had to be able to see the enemy. And we were largely in a development of what we call the Dowding system, which was from the Second World War, obviously radars, early advice to fighters, fighters scrambled, albeit now jet fighters, and we had a lot of them. When we talk about the 50s, were before Duncan Sandys took away a lot of the Royal Air Force, we had a lot of fighters. New radars were coming in. This is a Type 80 radar, very much better than obviously the chain home, which is superseded. And as you can see, the car there, it's still quite an early radar. And I just make a small aside here as well, that it wasn't just, we knew that the Soviets were fast equipping their forces with missiles, and more about that later. We sometimes forget that as part of the Cold War, and it was run by the Royal Air Force, we also had the Thor missile. I regret I haven't put a picture of the Thor missile up, but some of you may not realize that the east of England, and I'll point out from up here at Driffield in the north, down here to Shepherd's Grove, down here in Suffolk, Norfolk, Suffolk, I think that is, and over here to the west, over into Northamptonshire here, we had the Thor missile bases. I simply hadn't realized myself until I joined the Royal Air Force, and very much later on, how many bases we had with this missile. They came in 1959 and actually weren't in service for that long. They bridged a gap really before we got our own deterrent up, which is this. So we had the Thor missile, we had a counterpunch in nuclear terms to the Soviets, and meanwhile we were building up our V-bombers, the Vulcan, the Victor and the Valiant, all of which carried our nuclear deterrent. I should say, I mean, this is a wonderful picture of the last Vulcan, which is a most amazing high-flying airplane. Interesting, I always think that the Victor sometimes sits in the shadow of the Vulcan, but really the Victor was an outstanding airplane, and actually went, believe it or not, farther, faster, and carried a slightly bigger bomb load than the Vulcan. Quite interesting. And of course, the Victor went on to have a substantial career as a tanker airplane, which it took over from the Valiant, which was one of our early tankers. But it was the Vulcan, which we were, and the Victors and the Valiants, that we in the Air Defence Forces were having to defend. Our job was to get airborne and make sure our deterrent stayed credible by being able to provide the necessary defensive shield to allow these airplanes to get airborne and do their job. And that's about the time I came on the scene, so to speak. I've jumped ahead. I obviously came into flying in the 60s, and the Cold War was still at its hot height at that point. I well remember at the time I was going through training, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which many of you will remember, or perhaps will remember, was when the Soviets decided they were going to position missiles in Cuba. And Kennedy quite rightly said, no, you're not. And it was real tense times. The Cold War really nearly became hot at that time. Anyway, that was time I went through training on the venerable little jet Provost. Interestingly, I flew a jet Provost only a week or so back, and I'm about to recheck out on it. So how the mighty have thought, it's how the clock has turned again after so many, nearly 50 years, I suppose, but it's still a delight to fly. And that was now for pilots like myself, we were coming away from flying propeller airplanes in training into pure jet training, which I did. And I went on to the NAT. I'll only, apart from telling you this was a wonderful little airplane, but quite intimidating after flying such a benign airplane as a jet Provost. This little airplane was a real rocket ship. Something about it in the cockpit, which is, I think, the airplane was equipped with an instrumentation called OR 946, and it was quite well thought out in that it reflected the instrumentation that was going into two of our main airplanes at the time, the Buccaneer and the Lightning, one on the bomber strike side and one obviously on the fighter side. So once I'd flown with the OR 946 in this airplane, at least as it happened, when I got to the Lightning, the presentation was very, very similar. I then flew the Hunter. I mentioned the Hunter earlier on. The Hunter had come in at the end of that, the times of the Meteor, the Vampire, the Venom. And once it got its weaponry sorted out, the Hunter was always a bit short of fuel, not quite so short as aeroplanes I subsequently flew. So it generally always flew with external tanks. But the big problem when we first got the Hunter was when it fired its guns, the engines flamed out, which is a fairly fundamental problem for 30mm aim cannon. So it carried a good punch. Delightful aeroplane to fly, but obviously couldn't have that. Eventually, they put these what we called Sabrinas on the aeroplane, which caught a lot of the catches from the weapons or from the firing and stopped them being ingested into the intakes. The airplane then sort of sorted itself out and subsequently became a very good fighter reconnaissance, fighter and fighter ground attack airplane. Really the benchmark for the airplane, for the Air Force for many years to come. An absolute delight to fly. And the Sabres, which I mentioned earlier on, which we bought a couple of wings of to supplant our forces, were actually phased out quite early. So I flew the Hunter, and I did all my advanced training on that, as did many others. So we all did our advanced training on the Hunter. And then for me, it was to go to the Lightning, which at that time was the #1 air defense airplane in UK. We had 2 squadrons in Germany as well, but largely for home defense. It was a point defense fighter, designed to get up and go very, very quickly to intercept the man bomber threat from the Soviet and then the Warsaw Pact, because the Warsaw Pact had come into being in 1955. Many people think it came in at the same time as NATO, but that wasn't the case. It came into being in 1955. Now, this airplane is the T5 Lightning, which I was the one I went on to. I think I've told the story many times that the first time you get into a Lightning, it's just the most awe-inspiring airplane to fly. My instructor, Jimmy Jewell, as we wrought on our first sortie, which was largely just a demonstration sortie. I didn't know whether it was to demonstrate or intimidate us student pilots, but it did a bit of everything in equal measure, because as we went roaring space-wise in this airplane, my instructor rather laconically looked across at me and said, "There you are, young man." He said, "The only reason we have nav lights on the wings of this on the airplane. Sorry, the only reason we have wings on this airplane is to keep the nav lights apart." So it really was the most incredibly powerful airplane. It also was really quite advanced as well. It had auto throttle. It had a wonderful autopilot, and was actually designed from the outset, if we ever got to it, which we didn't, to almost be flown from the ground, through radio signals, to be able to fly it from the ground. Thankfully, while I was in it, it never supplanted the pilot, but it was quite an advanced airplane. I'll just make one mention in a second. Just notice that missile there is a drill missile, but it's got no wings on the missile. It's a red top missile. I'll come back to that in a minute or so, if I recall, because there's quite an interesting story associated with flying what we call wingless missiles. The reason it's got no wings on that, the drill missiles were on the airplane constantly, and obviously a live missile you'd only fly in war. We found that they were suffering from fatigue. Literally, we were at risk of losing some of the wings off the drill missiles, so they simply took them off. And as I say, I'll come back to that story. Great airplane. And that took me on to my first operational squadron. Now, all the squadrons, this is Treble 1 Squadron and the Mark III at Wattisham. All the squadrons, whether they were at Lucas or any of the other stations at that stage that were flying Lightnings, the airplanes and us were tested almost weekly, monthly by exercises, all part of the Cold War. We would strap into these airplanes. We would have a landline called a telebrief, which would connect us to our radar stations. And that's from there we would be scrambled. And we would take part in major NATO exercises. And we were also subjected to tactical evaluations, which were no notice events. So you'd be quietly asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning in the mess when the hooter would go, and you'd rush on down to the squadron. And sometimes, normally the first part of the tactical evaluation was to what we call generate the airplane, bring them to a state of readiness. Then you'd get a phase 2 part of the tactical evaluation, where again you could be a no notice, and then you would be flying. So literally from sleep down to the squadron, quick briefing, everybody rushing around, and sometimes you could be airborne within the hour on a major exercise. Now, the Lightning aside from being really quite advanced and having an outstanding performance, this is a red top missile. Showed you a minute ago, one without these wings. The interesting thing about those, you'll notice that the missiles actually have a 2-degree, the incidence. In other words, they're fore and aft, they're looking up 2 degrees. So those missiles actually provide a little bit of lift. And we didn't realize by taking the missile wings off the drill weapons, that was actually affecting our ability to lift the nose wheel off. It was quite difficult sometimes in the Lightning to get the nose wheel off. It went very well once everything got airborne. And as an American pilot in one of those 2-seaters, which I showed you a second ago, and we always carried another pilot in the right-hand seat because we'd had a few unexplained undercarriages retract. And we thought it was because pulling the chute handle, which is adjacent to where the undercarriage lever is on the left-hand side of the cockpit, we thought that that was folding the wheels up on the ground, which was a fairly big problem, even though the lever hadn't moved. So we carried a pilot in the right-hand seat to pull the parachute, brake parachute, from the right-hand selector, which is a lever similar, but on the right-hand side of the cockpit. And one day for taking off, chap I'd flown with, Gary Caterin, an American exchange officer who had just come from Vietnam, flying F-105's Thunder Chiefs, was taking off with, he was in the left-hand seat, with a Scottish chap, who sadly is no longer with us, but in the right-hand seat. And as he went down the runway, he realized the nose wheel wasn't coming off as it should be, connect with my point about the wings. And he uttered an expletive, shall we say it began with S and ended in T. And the difference in language between an American from the southern states and a Scot, the Scot thought the man had said shoot. Now he's still in full reheat, so the young student Scotsman pulled the chute, which was simply vaporized by the reheats at the back of the airplane. And then Gary Caterin, the pilot, decided he wasn't going to get airborne, so he aborted and took the throttles back to idle and then called shoot, only to look at the right-hand side of the cockpit to see the Scot had already pulled it. So they went wandering across the countryside in Norfolk for quite some distance, but luckily survived, as indeed the airplane did. Anyway, that's an aside. It's one of those lucky escapes we had. Great airplane and very advanced, but look, very short of fuel and with only 2 heat-seeking missiles. Terribly underfueled, terribly underarmed, and with only a pulse Doppler radar. So you see these sort of pictures, which was great. That's the sort of view you'd get from the cockpit as you went skywards. It was the most incredible performing aeroplane, and it certainly had get up and go. And for a young man, it was a wonderful rocket ship. But actually, if you looked at it, it was already very underarmed and very underfueled. And I think while we love to look at pictures of the Lightning going supersonic, and it was just wonderful to fly, the reality was that it was very underarmed. Later Marks had 2 30mm cannons, and as only the British can do, we put them in the extended fuel tank. So the Americans wondered at this. Only the Brits, one of our American exchange officers said, can put 2 guns in the middle of a fuel tank. But we did. And in truth, they were very important because the field of electronic countermeasures and flares were advancing almost daily. And a heat-seeking missile, while they became quite clever, this incidentally is a Fire Street, one of the earlier heat-seeking missiles we used to carry, they can be seduced by flares, and the Soviets were becoming past masters with flares. So as you can imagine, with only 2 missiles, meeting a Soviet bomber or whatever, and he fires off flares and you you simply couldn't bring him down if he seduced the missiles. So you were just left with, in this case, the guns. So we had to do something better. Incidentally, this is very much later, but this is the sort of comparative Soviet fighter of the time, the MiG-21. And this is a very late version of the MiG-21, not one which was probably in service at the time that we were flying our Lightnings, but came in much, much later. And typical of the Soviets, this was a very good airplane, single engine, very large single engine, not from RAF pilots who actually been able to fly the two-seat MiG-21, not a very pleasant airplane to fly in its handling characteristics, but not too dissimilar from the Lightning in its turning performance, less than the Lightning, and didn't climb it quite as well. So everything about it was not quite as good as the Lightning in terms of aerodynamic performance. It also just had a pulse radar, which was very poor in comparison even to the Lightnings. Trouble with the Lightning's radar was looking down was a nightmare, particularly trying to pick out enemy airplanes from ground returns or sea returns. But look how the Soviets had developed and the weaponry they are carrying. They're not only carrying extra fuel in the airplane, but they've got radar missiles, and they've got, in this case, 4 heat-seeking missiles. So they were really quite heavily armed. Now, these were obviously the aeroplanes that the Second Allied Tactical Air Force were going to come up against in Germany. And they were very much the front line over there. In the United Kingdom, it was unlikely, certainly in the early days, that we were going to come up against these airplanes, but it's indicative of how things were moving. Our enemy in UK were the bombers, which we were training for. And this happens to be the Badger twin-engined bomber, which could just about get to the Low Countries. And if it was carrying a standoff missile, cruise missile, it would have been a threat. And we did intercept these. They had an air-to-air refueling capability. Strangely enough, it was wingtip to wingtip. Quite interesting the way the Soviets did it. And when we intercepted these airplanes, they were aggressively flown. They didn't like us being around them. We also intercepted, of course, and we were intercepting the Great Bear, big 4-engine aeroplane with contra-rotating propellers, swept-winged and reasonably fast for a prop aeroplane, but massive. Look at that tailplane. That's just every bit as the wingspan of a Phantom, which I'll talk about in a second. And of course, it was still very, very Soviet. Tail gunner sits in there. So these airplanes were long range. They're still flying today. A bit like the B-52 for the Americans, the Bear is still flying. So what did we do? We had to counter this threat, and we were developing our aeroplanes. And of course, I show this picture of a Phantom landing on Ark Royal. This happens to be a friend of mine, actually, who I will see in a couple of weeks, an RAF pilot. The Phantom was our Phantom. This is the F4K. We had the F4M, and about that in a minute. I flew both, but not off carriers. The K and the M were developed from the American Phantoms. And while we had very small carriers, doesn't look small here when you see this picture, but it was. The Ark Royal was a particularly small carrier. It was felt that a fully loaded American Phantom, and I called it American Phantom with the American engines, simply didn't have the power to get all the bombs and everything else that you needed to get off a small carrier. And so they fitted the Spey engine. Now, this was a plus and a minus for the Phantom, I'll say in a minute. The Spey engine was a bypass engine fitted to, as you know, Nimrod and also to Buccaneer. the dear old Phantom was a bit of a flying compromise. Those big engines, while they were good when they had the reheats in, the augmentation from reheat was enormous. Unlike something like the American, I call it the American Phantom, with its jet engine or the Lightning. Yes, we had reheats, but the cold power was a greater proportion of the thrust. With the F4K and the M, which we bought, you needed reheat. And when you were in cold power, you actually had less power. And the other thing about these engines, it actually ruined what we call the area ruling of the airplane. And you can see this dear old Phantom coming to land on Ark Royal. The doors open everywhere, auxiliary air doors. It was a bit of a flying compromise, the Phantom. I loved to fly it, and I came onto the Phantom. This is a picture of the F4M, which is what we call the RAF version. It was only slightly different from one the Navy flew, better sighting system. But look, this airplane had a pulse Doppler radar where you could look down, shoot down. You had a lot of fuel, a lot of fuel. It had a navigator, weapon system operator, which I thought was wonderful. And it had 4 heat-seeking missiles. It had 4 semi-recessed radar missiles, and you can't see it quite see it in this picture, but here you've got a 20mm Gatling gun, heavily armed, great fuel, great radar. It was actually, despite my comment about it being a bit of a flying compromise, it was a wonderful airplane, but it did suffer from having an engine configuration which made its medium to high level performance without reheat quite modest. And indeed, engaging the reheats, which can be quite important in combat, they were really slow to light. You would engage reheat and it would take 1 potato, 2 potatoes, and eventually the reheat would come in. It never passed Boscombe Downs criteria for the speed at which a reheat should engage, but we took it anyway. And I'm glad we did, because it was a great warplane, but it was complex. And it didn't have some of the high performance and the technology even that the Lightning had, strangely enough. But as you can see, the airplane got more and more cluttered. And one of the reasons for this was that the Soviets were becoming ever more cute and capable in electronic countermeasures. And we were adding things to this airplane, not only from the weaponry point of view, but give us a better ability in what we called a heavily jammed environment, where the Soviets would try and jam your radars and your missiles and everything. So the airplane became very cluttered for very many reasons. If you can cast your mind back to that picture I showed you of the Sabre early on with that lovely bubble canopy, it wasn't so in the Phantom. And we really did lose a lot of visibility. But against the bomber, that was fine. But in a fighter-to-fighter engagement, we obviously were vulnerable. On the ground, most important, the Type 80 radars had been superseded by the Type 84 radars. An L-band radar, very powerful and great advance for us in the ground environment side. But as I said, electronic countermeasures, ECM, was very much the watchword in those days. We trained a lot in an environment for ECM, and the 84 radar had its vulnerabilities in ECM. So very quickly, that was the 84, they developed the 85 radar, which was a hugely powerful radar. And I mean, the story was that we never went to full power with these radars, because that would have really turned local fields brown, because of the RF energy that was coming out of these airplanes. They would literally burn through jamming. And they had other countermeasures which gave us some chance of seeing the bombers and not being obliterated by ECM. And with the Phantom, this was our target. I mentioned the bear earlier on. This is a picture I took, oh gosh, I don't hate to say how many was it, 41 years ago, my goodness. Yes, I don't like to be reminded of that very much, but that was taken in the North Norwegian Sea, so I'm a long way. The closest airfield probably for me then would have been Bodo or Keflavik. And I think I shadowed this particular aeroplane right down into the Iceland-Greenland gap before I came home. Took my last refuel, watched the Victor disappear into the stratosphere much faster than us, and we staggered our way home. I've told the story before. We often we had to take the nose wheel number. The spooks wanted that, and we obviously took the type of aeroplane it was. This is a Bear Delta. And we'd fly out once we'd got all that, and we'd fly in formation about here and look at this chap in this quite big, it looks a small bubble, but actually that's about the height of a man there. And you'd see this chap in it with a leather helmet, very much akin to what I call World War II tank helmets. And he would either smile and show us copies of Playboy and show us a Coca-Cola if there was no political officer on board. But we reckon that when they looked all grim and really rather sullen, they had a political officer on board, so they wouldn't say anything. But they were always trying to get us to roll away from them so they could take pictures of our belly of our airplane to see what new missiles we might have. And they were undoubtedly listening to our frequency as well. I later went to, once we had the Falklands War, we had to buy additional airplanes into the Orbat of the Royal Air Force. And I was lucky enough by this time to be a wing commander in command 74 Squadron. And perhaps this illustrates that great airplane that the Phantom was, and I love that this is the F4J UK, effectively an S model from the United States Navy. Same radar, pulse Doppler radar, 2 crew, lots of fuel, but with the original engines. And the original engines were akin to those put in a similar J79. They were jet engines. So you had a lot of cold power and an augmentation from reheat. Overall, on the ground, they didn't have as much power as the Ks and Ms, but as soon as we were able, if we were doing a formation takeoff with one of what I call the British Phantom, we would overtake them. And this aeroplane had a superb medium and high level performance. It's the only airplane I flew. Lightnings were still in existence at Bimbrook at this time. We'd kept them in service because the Tornado was taking longer to get into service than we'd hoped. It's the only airplane I can remember in doing combat training that I've come down from above on Lightnings, which rather surprised them because they were always looking down for Phantoms. But great airplane, and it still retained this area ruling, so its handling characteristics were actually nicer than ours, not by much, and it was still a bit of a compromise, that's for sure. That's just a nice picture. I know the Lightning spent a lot of time, on the tanker. We took quite a lot of fuel. In the F4J, we used to fly with just a centerline tank because we didn't use quite as much fuel. And this is myself and my navigator just about to plug in to refuel, actually on a Hercules. This is taken out of the back door of a Hercules. So the dear old Hercules was going flat out and we were going really quite slowly. The Tornado, obviously then was coming in, had problems early days, particularly with the radar, but they sorted that out and it became very good in the end. But very much a bomber destroyer, designed originally around a fighter bomber airframe. The engines were just basically quite low powered, so in terms of fighter v fighter performance, it was really quite marginal. Lovely aeroplane to fly, quiet as anything, quite spooky. You could actually almost take your helmet off in the cockpit and hear no noise. It was very, and the systems eventually, it was semi fly-by-wire, eventually became very good when they got, they got later electronic systems where literally the airplanes would talk to each other, which negated to a degree the lack in what I call combat performance. It was fast. At low level, it was as fast as any of the others. It took a bit of time to get there, but with the swept wing, it did have a 750 knot limit, but obviously it was a high Mach number. But meanwhile, while we were doing that, the Soviets hadn't stood still, and they had airplanes like the Foxbat coming in, radar missiles, a supersonic fighter, which was already being stationed, not a particularly agile airplane, but designed to counter high altitude, high speed airplanes as well. We used to laugh about, they used to scramble these to try and catch the SR-71 that used to go down the Baltic. They always got airborne late, and they were never going to catch an SR-71, that's for sure. But they also had some other fighters which were really making our heads turn as to where we were going next. And this is the MiG-29 Fulcrum, and it showed that the Soviets were really getting ahead with these airplanes. And you've probably seen these airplanes almost doing a stall turn at air shows and what they call the Cobra maneuver and things like that, which really forced both us and the Americans to develop airplanes like the F-15, the F-16, and us, the Typhoon. Now, I've done my 45 minutes and I've managed to rather fast talk. That sort of brings us up to the time when some people would say that the fall of the Berlin Wall was effectively the end of the Cold War. Well, I would argue that's probably not the case. And I could go on to talk about how we carried on after 1989, where this picture was taken. In fact, I was in the Falklands at the time, commanding the station there at the time the wall came down. While there was perhaps a temporary sigh of relief, I think is the best way, I think events have proven to us that the Cold War, even though the Warsaw Pact fell and we have enlarged NATO to a degree, NATO didn't have quite that political will behind it. And then suddenly there's the realization that the Russians now had not given up. And so their airplanes have been continued to develop. And of course, as we see today, Russian bombers still come around. So I would suggest we may not be in the frigidity of the Cold War that we had in the time of the Cuban Missiles crisis, but I think the dangers are still there. And we're certainly back to I would call potentially a mini Cold War, certainly with Putin and Russia. And of course, China is a different story. I'm going to come to a halt there if Christina is still listening.
I am, absolutely, Cliff. Yes, thank you. It was absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for your time. So we've got some minutes now to go through any questions if anyone wants to send a question to Cliff, and we have got some coming through now. And actually, just before we start the questions, a really nice comment has come through, Cliff, from someone I think you know. So Simon Thompson has said, it's splendid to see you again. And the last time we met very briefly, I was helping you push a rather overheated Spitfire down the taxiway at Riyadh at Fairford a few years ago.
Simon will probably have his own opinion because he's obviously Phantom Man, and he'd agree with me, I'm sure, that it was a wonderful aeroplane, but it did have its moments with the dear old Phantom. Well, lovely to hear from Simon.
And he has actually also sent through a question for you, Cliff.
Yeah,
just going back to the radar that you were talking about earlier, he's asked if the Type 85 was installed at Saxe-Voord.
I don't actually think the 85, I might be corrected by my GE colleagues on this, Simon. I don't think the 85, I'm not sure the 85 got to sacks aboard, but I may be corrected on that. Yeah, the answer is I'm not actually terribly sure. Dear old sacks of ore stuck right up there on the top of Northern Shetland, and it really was the furthest outpost. And I'm sure Simon would remember this as well. When we were doing interceptions way up into the North Norwegian Sea, and very long sorties as well from Lucas. And bear in mind, Lucas, when you take sacks of ore and the tip of the Shetlands and go down to still another hour's flying south, even in a Phantom. And I always remember we come back after a very long sortie, and they had what we called a long-range TACAN, a beacon at sacks of ore. And it was always sort of a sense relief when it came on at about 150, 180 miles. You were suddenly getting home, and it showed you we'd probably been flying south for an hour by that time. But it was still another hour and a half's flying by that to get home. Anyway, good to hear from you. I'm sorry, I can't remember, frankly. I will probably have to look back at the books on that one.
No problem at all. That's absolutely fine, Cliff. Thank you. A question's come through from Mark. He said, having seen you at Fly at Duxford last week, can you tell us how you got into flying Spitfires and the like? Was it via the BBS?
Yes, not quite the Cold War, but I was actually still a commander in the Air Force. I got into it, Mark, when I was commanding Coningsby. I was very lucky. I mean, I came back, I actually took command of Coningsby end of my tour in the Falklands, and I converted onto the Tornado and probably went out the Gulf War I and came back in 90, a few months later after Gulf War I. And Battle of Britain Memorial flight were at Coningsby. And one of the privileges then anyway, for a station commander was he's allowed to fly the airplanes that were lodged on his station. So I not only flew the Tornado, but I was lucky enough to fly the Hurricane and the Spitfire on the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. And that really, a couple of years later, when I thought I was going to finish flying those old airplanes, I met Ray Hanna at an air show when I was still flying with BBMF, and he asked if I'd like to join his group, even though he knew I was staying in the Air Force. He knew me through his son, because his son had been on Phantoms at Lucas on my flight, actually. So I knew that connection. He said whether you'd like to fly, and so I said, yes, I would. I'd love to. And my poor wife, who I'd told I'd only be away for weekends for 2 years while I was at Coningsby, that wore a bit thin 30 years later, but never mind. So that's how long story about how I got into flying those airplanes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cliff. Graham has asked, how close do you think we came to a hot war? Obviously, there were some particular moments of high tension there. So how close do you think we came?
That's a very, Graham, was it, Graham?
Yes. Yeah,
Graham, that's a very good question. And sometimes it's difficult, shall we say, in the lowly ranks to know just how close we got. I think, albeit I was just a sprog in terms of being in the Air Force, and I was only just in the Air Force, I think the Cuban Missile Crisis took us very, very close. I think it all depended on Khrushchev at the time. Khrushchev suddenly realized that Kennedy was not going to be a pushover. And for all his walking out of the United Nations and all this sort of stuff, there was a lot of showmanship with Khrushchev. But nonetheless, that difference between showmanship and resolve, it was sometimes difficult to know where that was. One of his biggest dangers was his bluster would have actually taken us into a hot war. I think he had a measure of reality that this was not where to go. but I think it got pretty close. And that's, I think, why even the Soviets and the Americans have so many checks and balances in their system. I won't talk about the recent president in the Americans because that's probably politically incorrect, but you've still got checks and balances there. So I think it was more likely to be a brush war and what we call proxy wars today, where we don't get to the heavy hitting side of things. But I think that's probably the closest I think I can imagine. But I think if we'd have shown vulnerability in NATO and weakness, I think the level of, so that we were able to stand up, then it wasn't worth getting into a hot war for the Soviets, as they realized. But it's a good question.
Did you feel when you were coming in and you got into your career, did you feel quite nervous then? I think you mentioned that the Cuban Missile Crisis was
I'd like to say that I had that sort of level of intellect where I was thinking outside the box. But the reality was, and although I knew I was in a serious business and I didn't take it that lightly, we were young men flying great airplanes, and we had maybe misplaced in some ways, but we had a level of confidence, some might even call it arrogance, that we were going to do our job. And we just loved flying these rocket ships that the taxpayer had given us to fly. I think it's only as you get a little bit older and a little bit more senior, and when you're doing the exercise and you're looking at the reality of supply, all those sort of things, things become a bit more somber then when you actually have to do that. So, but as a young man, no, I wasn't.
That's probably a good thing, really.
The only nervousness was I was going to pass the next test I had.
Lovely, thank you, Cliff. We've got a few more questions coming in, which is brilliant.
Yeah.
Tim has said, I recall a couple of exercises in the late 1970s in which the ROC reported visual sightings of RAF aircraft flying down the spine of the UK to the point of interception. It being said that there was a radar blind spot which the Warsaw Pact could take advantage of. Have you got any recollection of these or any of the circumstances giving rise to these?
Yeah, and that's absolutely correct. We did have blind spots, but I mean, there was the reality was, someone had to get across the first part into the UK, and then we did have those blind spots. And indeed, the Royal Observer Corps, of which I've got a great affection, and I'm indeed, as it knows, I'm president of their association, and was indeed the commandant while I was SASO 11 group. I was also the commandant of the ROC, albeit late then we were doing nuclear reporting as much as anything. So there was a very, inland, we would have been in those early days quite blind, and the ROC still had a very measurable job to do. That actually, those blind spots were taken out by the integration of other radars, later radars. It came into the whole of the UCAG, as we call it, United Kingdom Air Defence Ground Environment. And so those blind spots went away. But it still remained the approaches, particularly through the North Sea. And of course, then aeroplanes that may have gone round, as we call, round the top, and approaches from the west. So we did have radars that looked out west as well. But I think it was unrealistic if we'd got to what I call a Battle of Britain type of scenario where we'd had airplanes inland. I think things would have been pretty damn serious by that time. So I think it rather got overtaken by technology.
Thank you, Cliff. And we've got a question again from somebody else you should know. So Neil Campbell from 74 Squadron Armourer has said, "Hello, boss."
Hey, hi, Neil.
So he said, "It was my best time in the RAF for the Tigers. What were your thoughts being CO in that time in your career?"
Well, it was a high point for me as well, Neil, because, and I'm not just trying to earn a beer from you when we next meet, wherever that is, but the great thing about it was you had about 250 people, and although you had 40 aircrew, I had, you know, a couple of hundred ground crew who were just the bees. They were so they were so dedicated, and they worked so hard to keep our airplanes in the air. And I should have mentioned this earlier. But it was a corporate spirit. You had a sense that we were all doing the, you know, we had a business to do, and everybody really did get move together. And it was a high point for me to command a squadron. And the Tigers, what a motto, eh? A tiger's head with a motto of "I fear no man." Although I think Neil will remember that the ground crew rather irreverently put on one of the badges. They used to put an R in between N and M, because one of our NCOs was Norman, so it said "I fear Norman." But actually, as a squadron, the Tigers, and it was fantastic. Everybody just pulled together. It was a great family, and indeed, while I was on the squadron, we went down for what we called the NATO Tiger Meet, and it was held at Cameri in northern Italy, and they did a thing. They had a thing called the Silver Tiger, which was by general consensus of all the squadron commanders. They would nominate a squadron to have the Silver Tiger based on professional performance, corporate performance, you know, social performance, a whole lot, and we won it. And it was a great accolade because it involved everybody. So Neil, great to hear from you, and great to see people are still pushing the 74. I wish they were still in harness in the Royal Air Force.
Thank you, Cliff. I think we have time for one last question. So this one's from Cameron, who has said, "Great talk, thank you." He works as a host at Cosford, so he said he might pinch some of your anecdotes when he's on duty in the Cold War hangar. But he said, "You've clearly had the privilege to fly many types of aircraft. Do you have a favourite?"
Ooh, sorry, was that Cameron?
Cameron, yes.
Yeah, Cameron. It is a question I'm often asked, and I could look back on my operational career, obviously, and if I would time for time now against what we perceived the threat, and I think the best operational warplane I flew was the Phantom. It just had weaponry, it had fuel, it really had so much going for it, and we were confident in the aeroplane, and it was rugged, all those sort of things. I can't discount the Lightning in terms of just pure performance. It was just a rocket ship, and it was, you know, wonderful going into almost into the stratosphere. I like the Tornado as well, but you know, I think by that time, and it was a delight to fly actually to Tornado. It was really a delight to fly. Hunter, lovely. Hawk later on, lovely. I love the Nimrod. I'll not mention the Nimrod. I'm sure the maritime guys, when are you going to talk about the maritime? Well, it's almost a subject on its own and deserves a subject on its own. So all of those airplanes notwithstanding, those are the operational airplanes. So Phantom on the operational side. Purely from a flying point of view, if God said I have one more trip in any airplane of the 65 types and marks I've been privileged to fly, I'd probably say the Spitfire. Now, I mean, I know obviously operationally it's not, but I've flown it for about 25, 30 years. I suppose it's got a bit into my blood, and it is just a wonderful thing to fly. But it's historic, and it doesn't match up in terms of operational terms by 21st century terms. So if that sort of half answers your question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cliff. And thank you for that absolutely wonderful talk today. I'm afraid we are now out of time for any more questions, sadly. But I'd like to say a huge thank you to Cliff and to everybody in the audience today for joining us. We hope that you can join us again soon. And thank you.
Thank you.